GC Chat.
Welcome to GC Chat, a genetic counselling podcast. Just a reminder that these episodes are made to be listened to in the order that they are released. Please start with episode 1 of this season if you haven't already.
Please contact us if you have any reflections or questions about the case. We want to hear from people with a range of experience. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram or Twitter by searching GC Chat Podcast, or you can send us an email at gcchatpodcast@gmail.com. If you send us a private message or email, we can promise that your identifying details will not be shared in the podcast without your consent.
Just a reminder that all cases are de-identified in accordance with Australian and US privacy legislation. So any names used in the recording are pseudonyms. Our episodes contain material that may be distressing to some listeners. If you feel you need support, please contact your local crisis centre. Some suggestions are listed on our website, along with our privacy statement and disclaimer.
Our names are Ashley and Elle, and we are genetic counsellors currently working in Sydney, Australia. The aim of this podcast is to facilitate discussion and reflection upon the challenges clinicians may face when providing genetic counselling to patients. All opinions are our own.
We will start by reflecting on the case presented in our last episode. In this, we heard from a genetic counsellor who felt like she had opened a can of worms. A genetic diagnosis was finally established for a family, but pre-implantation genetic diagnosis and IVF for this condition failed for her patient.
Importantly, the genetic counsellor in this case, by establishing a diagnosis for the family, ended the diagnostic odyssey. The diagnostic odyssey is not an unusual experience for people with rare diseases and their families. It encompasses the time from initial disease recognition or symptom onset to a final diagnosis. This time is usually associated with multiple encounters with health professionals and sometimes a number of unnecessary investigations. For some families, this can be a confusing and chaotic time.
In this case, there were many years in which the family did not have a genetic diagnosis, and the original diagnosis of HCM was also later changed to one of Brugada syndrome. We discussed with a counsellor why a formal molecular diagnosis for this family was particularly rewarding.
But I think what I liked about this case as well is that it was a genetic counsellor who worked it out. In that probably I was the one who had the time to spend 5 or 10 minutes just looking at the file again. I don't always have the time. Why on that particular day as I was preparing did I think, let's look at this again?
We think it's great in this case that the scientific and medical knowledge of the genetic counsellor assisted in ending the diagnostic odyssey for this family.
We also spoke to the genetic counsellor about working with families in which there is a sudden cardiac death. The sudden death of a young family member can be devastating and can be the first presentation of an underlying inherited heart problem. Generally, a multidisciplinary approach to genetic counselling and evaluation of families is recommended and includes cardiologists, a clinical geneticist, a genetic counsellor, and the forensic pathologist who was involved in the case. The benefit of genetic testing and counselling in these cases is not only for providing support and an explanation after an unexpected death, it also allows for potential lives to be saved by screening appropriate at-risk family members. The counsellor talked about the skills used when talking to families who have experienced sudden cardiac death and the importance of a genetic diagnosis in meaning-making for some families.
At the end of the day, I realised talking to these families, just having someone who will listen to them, who isn't afraid to talk about their deceased family member by name, who wants to hear about the person that they were and what they like to do. Someone who says, we're going to try our best to find out why your son or daughter passed away and try and prevent it happening again in your family. I think we don't, the grief is still there. We don't make it any better when they go home or when they get off the phone. But I think knowing that someone is out there trying to find some answers really helps them.
We've added some useful references on counselling for sudden cardiac death in our show notes. Meaning making is a grief theory that fits nicely in some aspects of our work as genetic counsellors. This is essentially based on the idea that strategies can help patients construct meaning from their experiences and losses, and this may lead to positive adaptation. In the Journal of Genetic Counselling in 2015, Helm presented a case study in which he used a meaning-making framework to help a family explore and construct meaning from their experience of their child being diagnosed with Mowat-Wilson syndrome. We as genetic counsellors already have experience with grief counselling by providing education, outreach and psychological support, and the author highlights our value in helping facilitate adjustment for the client. Of course, there is a time and a place for this strategy, and its limitations are outlined in this paper.
Despite this, the counsellor wasn't convinced that Jane was too worried about getting a diagnosis. Jane had shut the door on having children, as she did not want to risk passing on the condition, or have that child grow up to see her family members suffer, like Jane had. However, over time, the counsellor identified that Jane was reconsidering the option of having children, as the molecular diagnosis would provide the opportunity for Jane to undergo PGD with IVF to prevent any future children inheriting the condition.
When the PGD process was unsuccessful and Jane decided to stop pursuing this, the genetic counsellor asked her if she regretted this journey.
As we were talking through over the phone about how she had come to that decision, I did ask her, do you regret that we ever opened this opportunity? And she's a very gracious lady and said absolutely not. She's really thankful for this part of their journey, even though she hadn't ended up with a child. And I think it's good to stop and think, we can do a lot in medicine, we can do a lot in genetics. But we go back to that ethical principle, do no harm. And so I guess that's what I was questioning. In all this, we wanted to find a cause. That's what we're all about, but which we did. But at the same time, we don't want to do any harm.
We often want to instill hope in our clients, but need to balance this with the likely outcomes. Overall, we think the counsellor provided a client-centred approach and had established great rapport with her client in the long term.
This brings us to our final reflection for Season 2, and we'd like to take this opportunity to discuss what we've learnt from our first 2 seasons. We're so thankful to have had such great engagement from our listeners, and we couldn't have done this without the genetic counsellors who are willing to candidly share their complex and challenging cases, their skill set and knowledge. As of this recording, we've had over 11,500 individual downloads across 67 different countries, just in case any sponsors are listening.
When we looked back on both of our seasons, we were struck by the importance of the genetic counselling role in various stages of a client's life journey, from planning a pregnancy, like we heard in our last case, to during a pregnancy, to the diagnosis of an unwell child. We also heard about the challenges of diagnosis in adulthood, which can be informed by so much of one's lived experience.
The genetic counsellors on this podcast have also shared experiences of supporting clients while deliberating about predictive and diagnostic genetic testing for themselves, while making meaning of a genetic diagnosis for their children, and after the death of a family member. In talking to our guests, the skill set needed and ability to adapt to a wide variety of scenarios is what makes this job so unique and rewarding, but also naturally poses some challenges. I know I can't be the only one that feels like they need to be paid more.
Amen, Elle. Genetic counsellors are talking to more clients about a wider range of genetic tests than ever before. Again, our episodes have required genetic counsellors to provide information and facilitate a number of different tests. This might be predictive single gene tests, CGH arrays, panel testing and a whole genome sequencing. And genetic counsellors have been required to not just communicate this to patients, but to members of other medical subspecialties as well. Although for some, their diagnostic odyssey may be shorter with the increased availability of tests, this process can still be fraught with uncertainty.
Genetic counsellors in this podcast have worked with clinical geneticists, obstetricians, metabolic doctors, neurologists, oncologists, paediatricians, cardiologists, and a number of others, and have advocated for their patients in many circumstances.
And to top it off, genetic counsellors in our cases have also had clients disclose serious issues, such as domestic violence, misattributed paternity, and suicidal ideation. This highlights to us how emotionally draining this job can be, and the emotional awareness and resilience needed. We surveyed you this week on social media, and around half had considered leaving the profession due to compassion fatigue or burnout.
If there's one thing we've learned from this journey, to quote Jerry Springer, it's that we need to take care of ourselves and each other. We need to support and advocate for one another as our profession evolves. We hope you feel as empowered by the wonderful profession we're in, just as much as we do.
Those are our final words for the season. We would love to hear from you if you would like to hear more from us in Season 3. Don't forget to use the hashtag GCChatPodcast.
GC Chat.